Well, we got all this open space here. We're going to change the shocks. There's going to be 2 bolts here that are holding the bottom of the shock, and that's going to be a 13 millimeter head on there, and then it's going to be a 13 millimeter on the nut as well. I came in from the bottom with the socket, ratchet, and extension, and then I used the combo wrench on top, and that's how I removed those 2 bolts from the bottom of the shock there. Now up top here's an entirely different animal, and you can only really fit in a couple small tools to try and get this. That's going to be a 1/4 inch combo wrench there to hold the top, and a 14 millimeter ratchet wrench to remove the nut. Hard to see in there, and there's a lot of stuff in the way, but you got to get in there somehow and get those tools in there and remove that nut off the top. And then once you've removed that nut off the top, you should be able to work from the bottom to remove that shock and then install the new one. Gonna need a lot of patience with this one here, and let's hope that the nut comes off easily and it's not seized on there in any way, because it's difficult enough as it is. I use some penetrating fluid to help it along, and when I reinstall the new one, I'm going to be using anti-seize and lots of spray and try to make it easy for the installation. Here's some part numbers for anyone who's interested. This is going to be the upper ball joint, lower ball joint, and then this is the shock that we're replacing. Here's the old shock on the right and the new one on the left, and then we have all of our hardware up top. It's going to come with these 2 metal washers here, the new rubber bushings, and then we've got 2 nuts there. The reason we have 2 nuts is because there's the one to tighten it down, and then there's going to be a lock nut to kind of hold it there. Down at the bottom, we're going to have to use the factory bolts that came with the vehicle, because no new bolts came with the new shock. So we'll angle that new shock in, we'll get the top up through the fender well, and then we will situate the bottom to bolt it up. Here's the new shock installed here. What I did was I put some new bolts in the bottom. The bolts I used were 5/16, so that's going to be a 1/2 inch socket and wrench to tighten those up. I got some nylon locker nuts on the top. I put the nuts on the top so that if they look like they're coming loose or whatever, you can visually see that. You might not be able to see that if they're on the bottom. Up in here, we're just going to use our small wrenches. So it's going to go washer, rubber, and then this is the frame, and then rubber washer, and then our first nut. Use the 1/4 inch wrench to hold the top of the stud, and then snug down that first nut as far as it'll go. It's not going to let you go too far with that short wrench. Go as far as you could go with that, and then put your lock nut on, and I think that'll be good where it is. You want a little bit of a squish on those rubbers, but you don't want to overdo it. Here's the top nut for our upper ball joint there with our cotter pin in, and you need to put this bracket in there because that's going to support our wheel speed sensor that gets bolted in right in here, and that's going to be 8 millimeter socket to tighten that up. And then as you go around, you're just going to clip these in where the holders are all the way through around that shock, and then it goes up in through there. And then down underneath the brake booster, that's where it gets plugged in if you're going to change that. And here's a part number for anyone who's interested. There's the castle nut for our upper ball joint there. We've got our cotter pin in, and I'm going to use a washer so that when the nut contacts the washer, instead of the bracket, it's not going to try and twist that bracket and break it. Again, on the bottom, I'm using a washer, and there's the nut on there and our cotter pin. And the upper ball joint is going to be a 7/8 socket, and the bottom one is a 15/16 socket in my case. Also, when I'm installing those 2 nuts, I'm going to torque those down to 80 foot-pounds. Now, after installing our steering knuckle, we can put our axle shaft in. That axle shaft is just going to slide in by hand. You might have to rotate it just a little bit to get the splines to line up in the carrier there, but it should go in real easy. We've got the wheel bearing on. Now, before you do that, you want to put your splash shield in place. Remember, this is the opening here for your brake caliper if you're trying to figure out which way that's going to go on. And also, this matches up with this so you don't flip it the other way and it sticks out. The 3 bolts for that wheel bearing, I'm able to fit a 9/16 12-point socket on there. It's roughly a 1/2 inch diameter fastener. It's metric. So I torqued those down to 80 foot-pounds when I torqued that down. I put on the nut here for our axle shaft, and I'm just going to use the impact to rattle that tight. And then there's a little spring washer, and then there's this locker washer, and then we got our Carter pin on there. Lastly, we put the rotor on, and then we put our brake caliper on top, and that should just slide on. We're going to start with the bottom. There's a little saddle in the bottom of the brake pads there that fit in, and then you kind of set it in there and then rotate the top end, slide it into place. In behind, you have a bolt here up at the top, and you have another one down at the bottom there. Those two bolts are going to be a 13 millimeter socket to tighten those down, and I'm just going to tighten those by hand. So that wraps up this installation here. We have yet to hook up our tie rod ends and our front steering components there. We're getting ready to put these steering arms on here, but before we do that, we're going to take the cover off of our front diff here. And the reason we're doing that is when we were replacing those upper and lower ball joints, we ended up removing the axles. And when we removed the axles, we cleaned out the axle tubes there, and I was worried that we might have got some crap inside the carrier here. So we opened that up. We're going to change the oil. We're going to clean it up real good. I'm going to use some compressed air and some brake cleaner, and we're going to clean the inside out as well as we can, and then clean that surface up there. Here's our cover here. On a previous video, I put a drain in the bottom, and also too, I got this magnet in there, and that's going to help capture all the garbage that floats around in the oil. We smear that RTV sealant all on there. We're going to leave that tack up for about 15-20 minutes, and then once it's ready to go, we're going to put it on, and I'm just going to snug that up by hand, and I'm going to let it sit for a little while longer before I actually torque it down. We've got that cover put on there, and we've torqued that down to 240 inch-pounds. Right here's the old setup here, and there's the new one. And what we had done was this original setup has this hollow rod all the way along here, and then it's got the two tie rod ends. We basically cut the rod, and then we got a stub off another one, and we welded that on there. So now this is adjustable, that's adjustable, same as what we have here. And then we have our regular configuration for this front rod. Now we're going to install that new configuration in place there, and then we got to do a rough alignment. We've got all of our steering rods and tie rod ends installed here, and this is with the modified bar that we had. So admittedly, when we modified this end of the bar, that's greasable and there's no room to get in behind there. You'd want to grease that before you installed it, which is easy enough to do because you can just disconnect it there, drop it down, and when the rod drops down, you can access it that way. We made sure that the steering wheel was straight where we wanted it, and then when we installed off of our steering link here, that rod goes over and then it connects straight into here, and then we've got this connection from here to there. So we've got an adjustable joint there, and we also have an adjustable joint there. We did our best to match those out as much as possible before we made any adjustments, getting the same amount of threads on either end of the adjusting nut. Lastly, we have our tie rod end that connects in there, and then we've got our steering stabilizer in the back. Now what I've done is I've tried to make everything the same, so all of my nuts and fasteners are going to be a 3/4 socket, so that's a 1/2 inch diameter fastener there. So I've changed these out, so that's going to be a 3/4 socket there. I made sure that was a 3/4 socket, and then when we're looking at all of our castle nuts for our tie rod ends up there on this side, and then again over on the end there, that's going to be 3/4 for that. We've got 3/4 for those. We've also got 3/4 for our track bar there, and 3/4 for our bolt that goes in for our steering stabilizer. As much as possible, I've tried to make it so everything is one wrench, one tool to do all this stuff. Now, after we've installed everything, we're going to want those adjusting nuts loose so that we can set our wheels to be parallel, and that's just going to be our rough wheel alignment. I put that level on the axle tube there, so we've got the horizontal level on that. And then on each rotor I've bolted a piece of angle iron here, so all I had to do is measure out our distance between our two nuts there. These are all going to be tight, so we want this tight when we're setting our alignment. And then that angle iron, we just bolt that on either side, and then we want to position it in a way that we can get our tape measure to measure on both ends. Here's our measuring tape here. I have the angle iron angled down because it's got to go underneath of all of our control arms and all that stuff there, and we're going to use that tape measure to grab the lip on the other side and then measure this side and see what it is. Over here you see that the angle iron is faced up, and that's just going to get just above our steering rods over to the other side. You need to have the steering stabilizer removed to get that tape measure to touch the other side and get an accurate measurement over here without anything compromising the measurement there. Lastly, you're just going to make sure you want the same measurement on either end, and then that is going to make the wheels parallel so that they're equal to each other. And we're just going to use this adjuster nut to do that. So it's within arm's reach here. We measure, we adjust. And you can do that by hand. In my case, I was able to do it by hand. I didn't need any tools. I just turned it around by hand. You turn it in, you turn it out, and it's going to angle this back or in. And that's how you're going to adjust that. Once you're done, you're going to tighten up your adjuster nut with those two bolts there and hold it into position. Last thing we did was we went around. We wanted to make sure that we greased all of our points. So we had our upper ball joint, lower one didn't have a grease nipple on it. And then we have our sway bar links right here, so there's a greasable joint right there. And then we have all of our tie rod ends, one there, one in the center, and one on the other side. I used the same method with those angle irons to do a rough alignment on the truck, and then we took it in and got a wheel alignment done at the shop, and this was the results here. So we got some real numbers that we can take a look at and compare. Here is our initial, so this would be what I basically set it at with my angle iron, and then this is what their correction final numbers were right there. Now really all we want to do is concern ourselves with the front, because that's all that we're dealing with right here. That's all we're adjusting. Here I had 2.9 and then they corrected it to 3, and here's our minimum max, 2.2 to 4.2. so obviously I was in the ballpark there, and again there, and then they corrected it to 3. And then I don't know what's going on here with these. I don't think those are adjustable. That's why there's no highlighted color on those values there. Here you can see I have a negative, and then they brought it into 0, and then again here's our minimum max, 0, and then 0.05 there. This is good on both ends. I had a -5 there as well, and then it looks like 0.10 positive is the max there. So these are the corrected values over here. Again, we're just looking at our primary angles for the front because that's all we're adjusting. As you can see, this is acceptable. We're in the ballpark here. You could drive the vehicle for a while before you had to get it adjusted. I would suggest that you do go get it adjusted after you're done, just to be sure that it is correct and everything's good.